Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers, Ancient Warfare Answers, with me, Murray, your weekly fix of ancient warfare stuff, where I attempt to answer a question from a viewer and a listener, or a listener. You, of course, can ask us questions. You can back us on Patreon to help support the podcast, and you can back one of three levels, Legionary, Optio, and Centurion. The question today is from Kurt. Did Alexander the Great's army introduce Pankration to India? If so, could Pankration have contributed to the future expansion of martial arts from India to China and other Asian countries? Wow, far out. That is delving into things that are not my expertise, and I do apologize in advance if I cause any controversy. I think the interesting thing is what, of course, we've got with Pankration is the ancient all-in wrestling of the ancient Greek world that we find at the Olympian Games and other places. It's not still done at the Olympics. It's one of the original 12 Olympic sports that aren't performed still. We've got lots of stories of famous. Well, actually, MMA is probably the closest to Pankration, to be honest, and that's not an Olympic sport. I think they're trying to get that into an Olympic sport, but. Anyway, it's a combination of boxing, wrestling, and there's all sorts of things which are practiced in Pankration, which are grapples and takedowns, chokes and joint locks and all that sort of stuff. But interestingly, Alexander the Great, we know from various different sources, along with his father, was a pancratist. They fought in Pankration while soldiers watched. So we know that they are performing this sport on campaign. They're practicing it. Fascinatingly, of course, they're also doing other things which get less focus. We know that they are, Xenophon tells us that at the end of the Anabasis, the Greek soldiers gather together and they show off all of their Pyrrhic dancing, their martial dancing. And there's other forms of dancing other than the Pyrrhic one, which is the most famous. So they are dancing, and the Pyrrhic dances are regarded as training for warfare. And so this idea that it's just about wrestling, there are several drills, for lack of a better term, that the ancients engage in that are martial, and we sort of focus on the ones that we consider martial and manly, rather than everyman dance to show us you're leaping, the Trojan leap, for instance, which goes all the way back to Homer. And Euripides, I think. Euripides? Yes, I think it's Euripides. So all of that is really interesting, but we're talking about Pankration, and we know that Alexander and his soldiers practice it. Now, going back, you've got the most interesting idea is wrestling a skill in ancient warfare? And I'm of the opinion that yes, it is, and that the field fighting in Athysmos and in the phalanx is much more involved than simply pushing with your shield. I think that there are skills and ideologies that we don't really emphasize, but we've got little bits of evidence which talk about the importance of wrestling in the hoplite phalanx. Epaminondas at Thebes, we're given various anecdotes, encouraged his hoplites to wrestle, the Sacred Band and others. And, it would be useful in war. We have another anecdote about him encouraging his men to wrestle against the Spartans at the Olympian Games and the Crown Games, so that they wouldn't learn to be afraid of the Spartans, that, if you've defeated this man in a wrestling match, he's not going to be any match for you on the battlefield. So that only anecdotally, implies some kind of effectiveness in warfare to these skills. And so I think that in the Athysmos, and the word Athysmos is massively debated, it means the push. And there's a lot of modern scholarship which talks about it not being an actual push. And I think, well, yeah, because you may have been working with your spear or your sword or wrestling in the push. So anyway, I think that wrestling is a applicable skill in the phalanx in warfare, and that therefore wrestling is important. So you would see wrestling in phalanx and possibly later in Macedonian phalanx warfare. And, why else are they practicing it? Okay. Anyway, also, now getting back to that, one of the things that's fascinating and isn't really highlighted in the Platonic dialogues is how many of them happen at wrestling schools. And of course, the context for most of the Platonic dialogues featuring Socrates is the Peloponnesian War. And so there's this sort of milieu of we are fighting a war, we are, training our hoplites, our young hoplites. Yes, there's the admiration of beautiful bodies, and yes, there's a bit of pederasty going on, but it's also the idea that wrestling is appreciated as a skill at a time when wrestling as a skill in warfare would be required. Anyway, that's a much more complicated and can't do that in 10 minutes. That's the gist of it. And I think there's evidence to back it up. But anyway, getting back to Alexander, yes, I think that there are martial skills that Alexander's troops are performing, practicing, and showing whilst on campaign, even as far as India. Does this, however, mean that they don't have their own martial arts traditions? No, I think that essentially every ancient warrior culture would have had some kind of martial skill, whether it be the dancing, whether it be wrestling, whether it be the hoplitodromos, the run and armor that we find at the Olympian Games. Another one of the sports that's not done at the modern Olympics, by the way. Oh, that should be brought back. And so I think that the idea that the later tradition of martial arts comes from a Greek or a Macedonian one is false. I think that those societies and all societies would have had their own traditions. Like most of those traditions, though, if they'd seen something or come across a practice that they liked or appreciated, they could absorb it into their own martial arts tradition. But I think that a lot of those traditions have their own independent history and that have gone on and spread independently or influenced, the ones going out in a way. Because there's a really interesting thing that, the spread of martial arts, if indeed they did spread from India into China and Asia from India, and I don't want to get into that controversy, they don't go the other way. There isn't the spread from India to Iran, Persia, and then into Turkey and that way, because they had their own. And, we don't often have much evidence of them. We do have some evidence of them with the Persian tradition, for instance, archery and learning to hunt. And we have several pieces, again, from Xenophon talking about that hunting is the best preparation for war. And so I think that there's probably much more likely that these things have their own traditions and those traditions spread. But that, again, that's not denying that there would have been a mixing. We don't know of any wrestling between the ranks of different armies, for instance. We do find that in the Greek tradition because they're the same culture. Perhaps with the idea of the mingling of cultures that Alexander has, perhaps there would have been a wrestling between Persians and Macedonians. You're going to have that problem that mixing and mingling of cultures was a controversy even in Alexander's own lifetime. So whether they would have agreed to do this or not is tricky. But there could have been an ancient MMA where you have a Persian warrior fighting against a Macedonian Greek who's a pancratist, for instance, and that sort of mismatch of the two martial art styles not really fitting, and that eventually the evolution, if you remember back to the early days of MMA, what kinds of fighters we saw there, very soon we didn't get martial artists. You got this kind of kickboxery, less jiu-jitsu-y, but some bits of jiu-jitsu borrowed in, less Aikido. There was an early thing about how Aikido would work and less Aikido in them now. So when you look at the modern MMA fighter, they're a polyglot art form, but there's a mixture of boxing and kickboxing and some, chokes and things like that, which is not a single martial art. It's a mix. And I think that that's probably where the history and evolution of martial arts may have begun, and whether Pankration had some emphasis or influence on what was happening in India is moot. So that's probably me sitting on the fence, but I don't think so. Anyway, lovely. We'll join you again. I'll join you again. Hopefully you'll join me for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks.